you addressed, I suppose you could call them hard laws in terms of prohibitions or standards that had to be met in terms of greenhouse gas levels. But whereas you use the example of the California credit system, what do you think about comparing this with, I think I'm right in saying Montana has a system based on bioethanol content of fuels that's more tax credits. So for example, you're using the carrot more than the stick. Do you think this is a feasible option? And do you think this will solve any problems with international trade if those rules obviously don't have a domestic content requirement?
So Peter maintained that the real issue is long-term leakage, that is diversion of investment from a country that takes strong climate change action to those countries that don't take climate change action, as opposed to, for example, industry relocation, packing up the bags and moving away because of the climate change regulations. And John's presentation seemed to show, for the UK anyway, that we haven't seen the UK industries packing up their bags and moving away. I mean, the levels of production seem to be the same, but the UK seemed to be meeting its increased demand from other countries. So, I mean, you could argue from that we aren't seeing industry relocation, but does that analysis say anything about the problem Peter was talking about, which is diversion of investment? Are we seeing, for example, diversion of investment, greenfield investment from the UK to China? I mean, I think you can see why it's a relevant question if we're trying to establish whether leakage is taking place or not. If it's not an issue, then the whole thing is sort of irrelevant. But if it is, then the policy solutions are quite salient.
My impression is that actually we are talking about a real danger or perceived fear. Because whatever literature, as of now, because I would like to be educated, because I first draw your attention to the book written by Mavriodis, Matsushita and Schweinbaum, and it is clearly written that there is hardly any empirical evidence that the countries, that industries relocate because of lax pollution controls. Then I had the benefit of the study carried out by Mr. Wooders and Cosby, and they stated that in the most of the studies undertaken in 1990s found that there were no significant pollution having effect. That is to say, environmental regulations did not have any significant influence on plant location, investment or market share. That is the presentation they had made in in 2010 in the climate conference in the CR. In that study, I found that even they had quoted the studies of Low and Eads, and in the typical found, they calculated the environmental regulatory compliance cost at about 2 to 3% of the total costs. And all the studies they have found, from their study I am quoting, they say that the factors influencing location and investment decisions are proximity to markets, natural resource input availability, labor costs, quality of human resources, political risks, macroeconomic stability, adequate legal regimes and infrastructure. So these are the factors influencing location. So why? Because and also they have stated clearly that there are little, but in most cases this impact is very moderate. So if there is no impact, then what we are talking about? This is my first question. The second question, you are talking about the putting a tax on the basis of emissions generated in the production. Now the question is, how do you calculate the emissions? Whether you are taking the total life cycle of the product or the production. Then the question is that, as Mr. Charles also pointed out, that you can indirectly you can infer. Now, what about after the goods have been imported? Most of the departmental stores are outside the city. So, what about the emissions generated in taking your vehicle to the supermarket and buy this product? So, it is a very, very complicated issue. Depending upon the technology you are using, the manpower you are using, the source of energy, and the quality of human resources, the carbon dioxide emissions for generating say a ton of steel will vary from shift to shift, from farm to farm, industry and country to country. So how do design a border adjustment scheme? The question is, because if you are talking about that, then it raises the issue of PPMs, product process and product measures. Now you all talked about steel. If I memory, because let us take the example of steel sheets. The tariff classification is 7208. Bars and rods of steel, the classification is 7213. So when the goods are imported, the custom officer will always classify under that item. It is immaterial whether the steel has been produced with the power generated by the nuclear energy or power generated from thermal sources. The steel will have the same physical characteristics. Regardless of whether it is produced by use of nuclear power or by use of thermal power. So how do assess the byproduct? The question is that. Because as you know, because I will just 1 minute I will take, it is empirically established the carbon dioxide, for example, that is a lot of literature, the Kenyan flowers that is air transported to Europe emit 1/3 of carbon dioxide as compared to flowers grown in Holland. New Zealand meat which is transported to Europe emit 70% less carbon dioxide as compared to the meat produced in US. Fertilizers exported from Europe, America to Europe emit 1/3, 13% less carbon dioxide as compared to fertilizer produced in Italy. So do you mean to say that the products will be unlike, and because of based on this carbon dioxide generated in the manufacturing process or the transport or the after the sales, if you design those sort of schemes, then it will invite a lot of problems at the border. I think if you see a cost benefit analysis, we will have more problems than we are going to solve. Thank you.
My question is also to John Barrett about methodology. I was actually a bit surprised to hear when you said that I think you use UK PAS 2050 methodology. I mean, as far as no?
We didn't use that.
Oh, okay. But I saw some footnotes that you conduct those measurements in cooperation with carbon trusts. Is that not correct?
No, the Carbon Trust used our data for some of the analysis.
Okay.
We did. I'll talk about PAS if you like.
Okay, maybe just in case you may have insight into my question. I mean, I still want to ask it because you are already on the subject. There is another standard at the ISO level about carbon measurement. It is about to be completed, I think, or it is just completed. I didn't check. And there is also another effort at the EU level about which combines the UK methodology, the French, and the ISO and greenhouse gas protocol. Do you have any insight about whether this UK methodology will be just phased out after these standards are completed? That was my question. Thank you.
I was just wondering if you could elaborate. I know you specifically said you weren't asking the question of what were some of the policy conclusions that might follow from a consumption-based focus, but I was just wondering if you had given that some thought and if you could outline from your perspective what some of them might be.
I read a couple of articles by Dr. Glenn Peters, essentially suggesting to some extent that the fall of emissions in Europe, for example, could be is almost equivalent to the increase of emissions in China and India or other developing countries in terms of the total scale, which at least to my mind suggests that that while you might have seen emissions reductions in developed countries, or at least in Europe to some extent, those emission reductions were more than made up for by the increase in emissions somewhere else. So at least my conclusion from reading those articles is that perhaps the problem was not the problem lies not so much in Europe changing production cycles or production methods to more efficient ones, but rather that emissions intensive manufacturing were outsourced elsewhere. And second, that consumption levels have not actually fallen consumption levels were actually maintained, which meant that you had increased demand for products coming from somewhere else. So maybe if you could, provide us with some suggestions on what kind of policy conclusions could be drawn from this, which might be relevant for the not only here in the WTO but also for the climate change negotiations, because this issue of how to handle the say differentiated responsibilities and obligations in terms of what kind of emission reduction commitments would come up as a result of a strengthening of either the UNFCCC or coming out with a new regime. It's going to be the answer to how you do emissions accounting, whether it's from a production basis or a consumption basis or a mixture of both, and then looking at what could be the policy implications in terms of especially the transitional opportunity costs for developing countries if there were policy measures to be adopted in developed countries to reduce consumption of emission-intensive products. What would that imply in terms of the kinds of cooperation mechanisms? For example, if we all agree as a global community that yes, we all need to reduce emissions, and as part of that agreement, we would developed countries would reduce their consumption of emission-intensive products by X%, for example, and that might mean that you'd have lower demand for those products, which might mean therefore that the export markets of developing countries exporting those products might become less. So what then would be the transitional costs, and how can we support the transitional costs for those? Thanks.
I think 20 years ago, when we started discussing the relationship between trade and environment, there was already it was already clear that there is no evidence that pollution havens exist and that relocation happens because industries are seeking going to countries where there are low environmental standards. Many factors, many other factors are relevant to those decisions. And to my surprise today, I come to learn the same thing. That there is no evidence of this carbon leakage, and at least not clear evidence. But it's really been very interesting to listen to all the speakers, and I'm very grateful for all their presentations. Having said this, my question, very specific, goes to Mr. Charles O'Verrill. I think he referred to the legal part of the discussion, and mentioned that the appellate body has emitted some rulings that are clear in that whenever there is a contradiction between, let's say, a GATT agreement and the TBT agreement, the later has precedence to the former. I'm not sure about this, because TBT agreement is part of GATT, so it's an annex to the GATT agreement. And my understanding is that aside from the articles, rules, disciplines of the TBT, any country applying a technical barrier to trade or a standard needs to comply as well, and not in substitute to Article 1, particularly non-discrimination among countries. Article 3, national treatment, so same treatment to foreign products as national products. Article 19, and equally Article 20 that you mentioned, because even if a country applying a measure through technical barrier to trade could not defend the measure, if it is challenged, there is always the possibility to go through Article 20, as you mentioned. But of course, would also need to comply with this non-discrimination, and that the measure should not be arbitrary, etc. So my point is, and my question is, could you mention one of those cases when the appellate body has ruled that a subsidiary agreement of GATT would have precedence to the GATT agreement itself. If not, then I misunderstood, and I would appreciate your clarification. Thank you.
Kyoto Protocol should be ended in 2012, then negotiation was very intensive. But in State Party Conference in Copenhagen 2009, everybody in Copenhagen, they said, IP, intellectual property, is out. Nobody must talk about IP. In the same week, we got here in Geneva, in WIPO, World Intellectual Property Organization, the Governmental Committee on Genetic Resources. And civil society was raising with enthusiasm that genetic resources are genetically linked with climate change. And everybody was agree, and it is in the official report. But don't forget that WIPO didn't want to be engaged, don't want to be on climate change until 2009. And in 2009, the program of the meeting was finally cancelled, and nobody heard about that. 2 years later, 2011, last July, there was this meeting, and there was officially the engagement of WIPO. In the same time, in the State Party Conference CBD in 2006, we decide, the International Committee decide that we will adopt the protocol, additional protocol about sharing benefit. We will be sharing benefit. But it is not an annual State Party Conference, it's biannual. Finally, it was adopted in 2010. But of course, there is a link between all those instruments in the international negotiations. But don't forget, in WTO, there was not ministerial conference between 2005 and 2009. And for this reason, maybe we'll have another step in 2011, with the decision will be taken next ministerial conference in WTO. Then everything is linked, and this is a hard negotiation, and diplomacy use a timing. Thank you.
3 questions directed to me. The first by Nick, which was my view of the California low carbon fuel standard proposal, not proposal, but regulation, and the Montana rule, which relies on tax incentives. My view is that in the United States today, we have a very, very clear, I think, political environment in which, on the national level, nothing is going to be done about climate change. And for that reason, I think it is very useful that the states, and it's not just California and Montana, are trying out various methods to address climate change. And I think this has always been an interesting part of the federalism that exists in the United States. Justice Brandeis once said that the states are laboratories for national action, and I think that is going on today, and as far as I'm concerned, it's a very good development. How it will evolve, I just can't respond, because we're just really starting with both of these, or all of these, and perhaps someday they will all become a model for national action, but that's, at least we have underway this experiment. The laboratory is under consideration. On the question about the TPT relative to GATT 1994, there's an interpretive note to the agreement establishing the World Trade Organization, which provides, and I'll quote, "In the event of a conflict between a provision of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade 1994, which includes all the provisions you mentioned, and a provision of another agreement, namely the TBT and a number of the others, the provision of the other agreement shall prevail to the extent of the conflict." I mentioned appellate body, I was wrong. The definition of conflict was most, I think, explicitly noted in a case called EC Bananas 3, where there was a panel determination which said that a conflict appears where the provisions, obligations are mutually exclusive. And it gave the example of the agriculture agreement, which specifically permits quantitative restrictions, I'm sorry, the agreement on textiles, and Article 11 of GATT, which does not permit them, and said in this case the agreement on textiles would prevail. I have a very long and elaborate viewpoint on why the provisions I've proposed relative to the TBT would be in conflict with Articles 3, etc., which we don't have time to go through here today, but that is the fundamental basis for my observation. And finally, as to the third question, I'm sorry, sir, I did not quite understand exactly what you were asking me to respond to.
Yes, I just want to raise that there was an important timing link between negotiations in WIPO about UNFCCC and TBT, because WIPO didn't want to be engaged on climate change and intellectual properties until 2011, until July 2011, and because timing is a tool, because Kyoto Protocol should be until 2012, and of course there is a link. Finally, we adopt last year Nagoya Protocol. Just I want there is an important link between international negotiation between those four international organizations.
I'm not sure I have an answer to your question. Now, of course, my view about the TBT is that it's becoming increasingly a matter of dispute at the WTO and in the dispute resolution body. Virtually anything can be called a technical regulation now after the tuna dolphin decision. And now whether that requires reconciliation with WIPO and the various WTO agreements concerning intellectual property, I'd have to think about that a little more, and I don't really have an answer for you at the moment.
So it was raised by several members of the audience that we have hardly any evidence of a pollution haven effect or of relocation because of environmental regulation, and that's true. It's also true with regards to carbon leakage. So far, we haven't seen. I mean, most of the studies that look into this don't identify impacts of, let's say, the EU ETS, which is the most advanced carbon regulation we have to date, in the sense of economies, closing down a factory in Europe and opening another one in China or India or somewhere else in the developing world, or theoretically at the US, which also doesn't have a price on carbon. So that general statement, as far as what we can observe today, is true, but I think it also needs to be qualified. And there are 2 points I'd like to make. The first one is that may change because the costs of regulation are likely to increase. So to the extent that, to stick with the EU ETS example, that becomes the EU ETS sets more ambitious targets, the price of carbon is likely to go up. There's also going to be a desire to phase out free allowances at some point and to move to more auctioning, which will also increase the cost. There will probably be pressure from other sectors that free allowances to energy-intensive sectors cannot continue forever, because what that means is that the cost for all other sectors goes up. So it's likely that we will see higher costs. And in this particular case, a lot of the studies that have been done on the impacts of environmental regulation and whether that led to relocation made the argument that overall in the cost structure, the cost impacts of stricter pollution controls are very, very small. And here we have a few industries where the cost impacts of a specific environmental regulation, namely a carbon price, are likely to be very, very high. It's quite possible that in this case this will be different than many of the things we've looked at in the 90s. And the other thing is what has been mentioned on the panel. This is probably much less about production relocation, about actually closing factories and opening them somewhere else. It's probably much more about long-term shifts of investment, new investment not being made in jurisdictions that have a high carbon price and being made elsewhere. And also about demand shifts. The example of the UK, where it's not necessarily that a lot of industries are shutting down in the UK, but it's just that additional demand is being met by imports from elsewhere because they're more competitive. How to calculate? I think that's a very, very, very valid question, and it's very difficult. It's one of the issues we're trying to address in our guidance on best practices. I just want to mention that there are a number of product standards that are being developed. So I think this is this, for many reasons and because of many drivers, this is an issue that we're trying to solve anyway. There's also private sector demand. There's more and more retail chains, for instance, that want to inform their consumers about the carbon footprints of their products. So there is a lot of, WRI is involved in the development of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol together with the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. We just launched a product standard a few weeks ago. So I think this problem is being tackled. It'll be difficult, and any of those standards will use a lot of default values. So one of the critical questions will really be to what extent, so it's one thing to use that standard as just a basis for an information label, and it's quite another thing to use it to assess a levy at the border, because then it has a real, it's probably fine if it's just information, if you can't be sure to the last digit that what you're assessing is correct. If you're basing a tax on it, that's something quite different. So it'll be important to allow for these, exporters to supply information so that the rate can be adjusted to what's actually being emitted. And finally, I wanted to talk about the policy conclusion. So what does the whole consumption-based accounting mean? Because that was also a question that was raised by several people. So if what we're seeing is that that the developed world is responsible for 22% of the emissions in developing countries, if you accept that responsibility, then responsibility probably means that you have to do something. If the developed world is responsible for that, that means the developed world has a responsibility to make these emissions decrease. And the way countries so far have acted on that responsibility, the tool we've used to make emissions decrease is by pricing them. And if a developed country prices the emissions that occur because of its consumption in developing countries, you get back to border carbon adjustment. So I think there is a link here. The resources in many developing countries, at least, aren't necessarily there to adapt to these transitions or to upgrade their installations so that they could have a similar level of efficiency. The question of support mechanisms to help with that transition will be important, and that's why what's one of the reasons why we discuss the issue of what we would do with the revenue from any such schemes in our guidance, and why we recommend that. I've been in our group. I've been amongst those who said we should really clearly recommend that these are being channeled to developing countries to help them upgrade their efficiency. I hope that helps clarify the issues a bit.
And what we can learn from pollution havens. I think we should turn the question round a bit and sort of say, if there are countries or regions who are out there who are willing to take strong unilateral action, what tools and techniques do they need in order to support them to be able to do so? So if we ignore the idea that there can be international agreements, but, for example, the EU might want to plough ahead anyway, how can we give them the support? I don't think we'll learn much from the pollution haven type arguments or from the current level of carbon there. On the sort of policy questions on the consumption-based side, I think it's so complicated to do consumption-based accounting on any sort of product basis. Could we just do it for 2 or 3 key products, key commodities, steel, cement, for example? Agreeing with you as well about how they're treated at the border in customs terms, which makes it more simple. If we were able to put something in place for those, would that be enough to kind of, to bring them into to stop them being a barrier to more general progress, if you accept that to be a contention? And the key issue on the steel is not necessarily that it's an international, it's not a country-by-country issue, it's more a technology issue. Either you're making a steel with a blast furnace or you're making it with an electric arc furnace. And you need to be able to distinguish between the two if you're going to have a sensible scheme there. And then finally, again on that consumption-based sort of issue and whether we should take it forward, I think we'd probably be better to focus on where the emissions are really coming from and the capture there. If we did some work on trade from China, and the paper is available at the back of the room. 50% of China's emissions are from the electricity sector. So the target is the Chinese electricity sector. Can we really capture that by consumption-based accounting and by schemes like that? I don't think we can. Similarly, transport sector regulations must be a very strong thing to do in all countries. We can drive our cars around much more efficiently than we are now. I think that's a better target than trying to do something that's extremely complicated and probably unworkable.
I was an independent advisor to the UK government on the PAS 2050. We wrote a methods report which is hidden somewhere on the DEFRA website, which said that we didn't think that PAS 2050 could provide consistent, comparable carbon footprint of products. That was generally ignored. I have generally quite a few issues with the commercialisation of carbon footprint standards. And I felt it was pushed through without considering some very large methodological problems. One of those key problems is the truncation error associated with process life cycle assessment. What that means in reality is that you place an artificial boundary around a product to try and assess it to simplify the assessment. Many academic studies have shown that that captures probably only about 50% of the product, but varies greatly depending on what the product is. So I completely agree with these complexity of carbon footprint products. There's also the issue of how you deal with capital investments of that. There's the issue of use phases. It goes on and on and on. But I suppose we still have a duty to try and find climate change mitigation policies in the absence of a global agreement. So I also do not want to completely reject the world which is trying to find ways through to find answers to something which needs urgent action. On the general point, I was generally asked at one point, I think, to put a whole new climate change regime together that would work from a consumption-based approach. I'm not going to quite do that at this stage, but what I am going to say is that one thing that the study in the UK and other countries have shown is the myth of decoupling. From a territorial perspective, it looks like the UK has managed to improve economic output over the last 20 years and reduce emissions. As soon as we take into account trade, we realise that that is not the case at all. We only have a case of relative decoupling, where our emissions are climbing not quite at the same rate as economic output. And virtually every country is following that pattern. And methods such as structural decomposition analysis clearly show us that that's the problem. And if we take that, there are also increasing number of studies which show the limitation of technology to deliver sharp and rapid declines in mitigation. So if we cannot rely on technology to do this alone, we're running out of options. And we either come up with a miracle geoengineering solution, we either reduce population, or we reduce economic output. Now, if we're actually going to talk seriously about this, we actually have to think what this really means in reality. And I think one thing the consumption-based side does is open up a new policy options which look at the composition of consumption and whether we actually need policies in place which look at demand management for the most carbon-intensive products. I'm not favouring one policy over another here. This is the reality of meeting tight global carbon budgets. We did actually, potentially in the UK in 1997, almost push through a transport demand management policy. That got rejected and then that got ignored now for the last 15 years in UK policy. That's the closest we've got. We still don't have policies to do that. We're happy to play on the fringes of green economy, where we'll be more resource efficient, where we might support the restorative economy, etc., etc. But the reality is that potentially we need to go that step further, and I think that's what the consumption-based approach tells us.
I think that at least what we can say is that we have spent quite some time and energy talking about feasibility and challenges to different methods. We have talked about what's necessary in terms of efficiency of different tools, but something that we have talked less about is politics. And I do agree with Lutz that the developing country divide is less of a reality today, at least if you look at mitigation efforts, because as we have heard on this panel, some developed countries are not that ambitious quite yet when it comes to climate change mitigation, whereas emerging countries actually are undertaking mitigation efforts. But I think that the divide is still present when it comes to politics, and in particular when it comes to trade and climate change, where many developing countries are very concerned about impacts on their trade through climate change mitigation. So I think that what is necessary is really to have an informed debate about all of this, and I think that this panel has done a great job in doing that and contributing to informing the debate.